Let's take a look at using the Network and Sharing Center to create a connection. We'd set up a new connection to a network, to connect to the workplace. And connect to the workplace, we would use my internet connection. It's a VPN. Plug in the address of the machine that I'm going to be connecting to. Just doing this for a sample here, okay? And then we'll hit create, and it will create the connection for us. If we then go into adapter settings, you'll see your My VPN. Go into the properties of that. The host name or address that you're going to connect to. If you need to dial another connection first, that's not overly common. You'd have to have dial-up internet to need to do that. Over on options, there are some PPP settings, but this is typically not, necessary. I mean, these two should probably be checked. Multi-link is not going to be relevant if you're not doing a dial-up connection. Over on security, it's where you configure the type of VPN. Okay, and so it's automatic. It's going to go from the top down because the top is, in this case, I suppose the bottom up. When I say top down, I just mean the IKE v2 is the best. It's the most secure. It provides the most functionality. So it's going to try that first, then SSTP, and then the others. If you've got a Windows Server 2008 R2 or later VPN server, then you'll support IKE v2. Okay? And then there's third-party products that will use that as well. Although anytime you deal with third-party products, out in the real world, you're going to probably have their own client. I mean, I've never, Cisco and Juniper and these other VPN solutions, think of the name of the other one that I've recently used. They all have their own client. Nobody uses the client built into Windows. So unfortunately, at least in my experience, I'm just going to throw this out here. In my experience, this little portion of dealing with the client is not overly realistic. In other words, you're going to probably see it on the exam. You need to know how to create VPN connections. But very few organizations that I've ever run into are using Microsoft for their VPN solution. Now, maybe that changes with Azure, and we see more and more people hosting VPN solutions in the cloud and utilizing direct access. But as of this point, I mean, I have not run into that greatly. So I just throw that out there. This is one of those areas where you kind of have to learn it because you need to know how to do it inherently in Windows. You may not be able to put that into practice at a lot of job locations. The type of VPN then, the data encryption, okay? It's optional encryption by default. We'd probably leave that, but sometimes maybe you'd say require. And this is where you can configure the authentication. Now depends on the type of VPN, so for TP, we've got EAP with either MSChap or Smart Card, which is TLS. Of course, there are some other options. There's lots of different variations of EAP. And then you can allow older, less secure protocols. So these would be with password authentication. The vast majority of these would be certificates, although there's a couple there that are password. And those options, as I said, are going to change slightly depending on what you are doing. So if I'm just using machine certificates for IKE v2, otherwise you can use password or you can use individual user certificates. Over on the advanced settings, this is where that mobility option is. Okay, so it's checked by default. Network outage time is 30 minutes by default. You can modify that to whatever you need. Then over on the network settings, one of the interesting options is going into TCP/IP properties. What's going to happen when you connect to the corporate network is you're going to obtain an IP address automatically. Okay? You're obtaining an IP address from the VPN server so as to be able to communicate on that network. And you'll be able to obtain other options as well. And so that's going to be the norm. You don't really need to go in and mess with this, but there's a setting over on the advanced properties, and this properties is not really opening up, but you get into those properties, there's a setting to use the default gateway on the remote network. And I would want to uncheck that box because sometimes that causes problems with internet access. Okay? Once you've got it configured, we would right click and say we want to connect. That shoots me over to the network and internet section of settings. This is your My VPN. You know, we can do everything from here as well. So when we go into the properties, we see what type of sign-in it is. You can see some other configurations here. If we hit edit, you've got all these options. So I showed you the old way. Now this is kind of the new way. If you go in automatic configuration of trying to detect scripts, and you can point to where scripts are, but this is really for proxy stuff, okay? So let's go to VPN, and if you wanted to connect, then you would just make the connection, you would sign in. Now that's not actually connecting anywhere, so I'll stop there. If you want to add a VPN connection over here, using the Windows built-in provider, here's the connection name. Okay, server name or address, and then same kind of stuff. Okay, you're going to have the same choices here, and then you would save it. All right, so whether you want to use Network and Sharing Center or use Network and Internet in the Settings app, you're really getting the exact same options. When you get into you still have to go to the adapter options to get all of those advanced settings that we were looking at, primarily the stuff over here. But if you're doing that, we would definitely want to make sure that we're configuring it correctly. You know, if you misconfigure it on the client or the server, then they can't negotiate security, and that's a cause for potential problems. An alternative to virtual private networks is another type of remote access called direct access. Direct access first debuted with Windows 7 and Windows Server 2008 R2. It was made significantly better and enhanced in Server 2012 and Windows 8, and many of those enhancements, or all of those enhancements, still exist for Windows 10. Direct access is one of those things that's really a server setup. You know, from the client perspective, there's not a whole lot that has to be done, and what is configured on the client is really configured via group policy. So, you know, I've always personally questioned having it in the client exams, but I understand it's a method of connectivity. You know, it's a means of remote access, and so Microsoft wants us to have at least some general knowledge as to how it is set up and understand the functionality that it provides. So it said it's an alternative. Instead of having a traditional approach where you've got what we just saw, a VPN connection, which I actually have to click and say connect, direct access intends to provide automatic connections over the internet to the corporate network. So essentially, when a client with direct access configured has an internet connection, they will automatically connect to the corporate network, receive an IP address, and be able to access internal network resources. The result of direct access is identical to that of a VPN. The difference is you didn't actually initiate the VPN connection. Now you might be saying, well, is that really that huge of an advantage? It is, because you don't have to deploy the VPN client. You don't have to configure it properly. You don't have to explain to the mobile user that the reason that they can't access their MAP network drive is because they didn't actually initiate the VPN connection. You know, it does have a good effect on user productivity because people are able to access internal resources seamlessly, whether they're on the internal network or they're at a hotspot at a coffee shop. You know, they can still access those same resources. That is why it's very beneficial. It is going to use various protocols. It is utilizing IPv6 connectivity. End-to-end authentication and encryption are configured using IPsec. And it is a bidirectional connection, so Windows updates, group policies, those can be pushed to clients. It's not just the client connecting in, but those clients can be managed. The remote computers do connect directly to intranet servers. Now that's a statement that applies to one method of direct access connections, you know, so there's a couple different ways to set it up, but that is a possibility for them to connect directly through the DA server, but directly to the intranet servers. There are a ton of different components for direct access, and as I said, if we're in a server class, we're going to spend a lot of time here. That would be overkill for us. We want to get an understanding of what it is, and what the various components are. but the setup is very much all on the server side of things. Okay, and so we'll stop short of that. I mean, I'm just going to go through the list of components and give you an explanation as to what each of these are. So the direct access server is a server running Server 2012, hopefully, because it doesn't have the same limitations as Server 08 R2 did. So Server 2012 or later, it's functioning very much like a VPN server. It's the point of contact for these clients that have direct access enabled. Direct access clients, enterprise and education version, are the only ones that support direct access. You would ideally have them be Windows 8 and later, Windows 8, 8.1, or 10, because Windows 7 has some limitations in this area. So those are clients that have actually been configured via group policy to make a connection to the server. Now, the configuration of the client is actually just the creation of some connection security rules. Connection security rules are IPsec rules. And so it tells the client that it's supposed to establish this IPsec tunnel between itself and the DA server. Okay? That is the configuration of the client. You could do it manually, but it's going to be done via group policy. So we're talking domain members, laptops. We're not really talking home computers here. We're talking domain members like corporate laptops that would be mobile and that we want to have access to internal resources even when they're outside of the organization. Okay, they do have to be enterprise or education level. You have a network location server, and this plays a key role in the whole direct access setup. The network location server is used by clients to determine whether they're inside the network or outside the network. Okay? The network location server is basically just a web server, but it's a web server that's only accessible on the internal network. And so the client will try to communicate with the server. If it can resolve the IP address of that name, then it knows that it's on the internal network and the connection security rules are deactivated and it's just accessing things normally because it's on the LAN. If it's outside of the corporate network, then it knows that it cannot reach the network location server. There's a little bit more to this. I mean, that name is in what's called the name resolution policy table, and it's an exception in there. So essentially it tells the client, hey, for this particular domain name, you have to use an internal server. Well, the client understands then at that point, okay, I can't query the internet name servers for this particular name, therefore I must be outside the network. Therefore, we're going to go ahead and access these connection security rules and establish a tunnel between myself and the direct access server. All right, so the NLS is just for the purpose of determining where the client is and whether or not to use direct access. Active Directory Domain Services is, of course, required for this. That's where the group policies are established. It's where the user accounts go. The computers that are connecting via direct access have to be members of the domain and those kinds of things. You do generally want a public key infrastructure. It is not technically required anymore, but there are certificates that are going to be utilized, and certificate authentication is going to be the best for the client machines, the client computers, so it's best to have that. DNS servers internally, which that's kind of a moot point. You're already going to have that. And then the name resolution policy table is what determines what the internal namespaces are. We had talked about that using the gateway on the remote network and causing a problem with VPNs. That's not a problem with direct access. In fact, direct access, when the client is connected, the only things that go to the corporate network, the only data that goes to the corporate network is data that's actually intended for it. And that's because of this name resolution policy table. The NRPT is a local table configured via group policy, and it tells the client the namespaces, the domain namespaces that are on the internal network. So if the client is trying to resolve www.google.com, it's going to use the internet name servers. If it's trying to get to file server 1 in company.local, and that's the name of the domain in the policy table, then it sends it through the direct access. Okay? So again, the key benefit is transparency. Transparent access to network resources for mobile clients. Having said that, as soon as you say These have to be enterprise clients. They have to be running enterprise level software, and they have to be domain members. You've immediately eliminated some of the potential connections that would be made with a VPN. We're not talking home computers, but yet when I make VPN connections, it's often off a home computer, or it's on a laptop that's not a member of any domain. So direct access is a great answer for a particular scenario. It's a great alternative to a VPN in that scenario. It's not an alternative to VPNs in every scenario.